Welcome to the expert session for SOA Summit. This is the session for SOA Software, and joining us this morning from SOA Software is Sachin Agarwal, Vice President of Product Marketing and Strategy. Sachin, welcome to SOA Summit.
Thanks, Lance. Glad to be here.
In his post, Sachin drives product marketing strategy and customer adoption for SOA Software's API management solutions. Prior to SOA Software, he's held senior management posts at Oracle, Oblix, and Infosys, and in fact brings more than 17 years of enterprise software experience in infrastructure, security, and middleware. All these technologies, of course, converging into this world of APIs and SOA, and that brings us to Sachin's session, Are APIs and SOA Converging? Question mark. We'll get a lot of insight on that. Sachin will compare and contrast traditional SOA services and API, and he'll also give us a view of how architects can plan, build, run, and promote their APIs and continue to manage them once they are launched. So it's going to be a terrific high-level conversation as well as some very practical tips. And just a quick reminder, if you haven't already done so, you can download Sachin's slide by simply clicking the button at the bottom of the viewing screen. And you'll see he also brought some terrific downloads there that are available for you right now. And where we can, we like to make this interactive. So to connect with Sachin and ask him a question or make a comment, just type into the Submit a Question box right under that viewing area. And now, Sachin, tell us about our APIs and SOA Converging.
Thanks, Vince. There's a lot of debate that has been going on in the industry about really what are APIs and how are they similar or different to SOA. So to address this, what I'm going to do today is talk about the basics, the basics about what really is SOA. Then I'm going to talk about what is an API. And then I want to drill down into the details of what are the differences between API and SOA, how they are similar, and what do enterprise architects and business personnel as a whole they need to consider about API and SOA infrastructure when they're thinking about deploying one. So what is SOA? And frankly speaking, there's a lot of confusion around what SOA is. It's more like the Sax's elephant. It all depends from the perspective of who is talking about SOA, and they have various different perspectives about SOA. It could be something like it's a technology. Some people think it's a protocol. Some people think actually SOA is dead. So there's a lot of different perspective around SOA. So let me just quickly define what SOA is. SOA stands for Service-Oriented Architecture. This is a SOA Summit. I'm pretty sure all or most of the people who are attending this already know about that. But at the core of it, SOA is a loosely coupled architecture designed to meet the business needs of an organization. The key to SOA is the first two underlined words that I have, which is it's a loosely coupled architecture. And just to describe that a little bit in real terms, if you look at any enterprise, they have a lot of applications, homegrown applications, legacy applications, enterprise applications from SAP, Oracle. They might have applications now in the cloud. They have data sitting in different data repositories, different kind of services. And a lot of these need to be integrated to each other, and not only each other, they need to be surfaced on desktops, on web applications, on shopping carts, and now mobile applications. So there's the need of integrating, taking information from one place to another. And traditionally, before SOA came in, it all used to be point-to-point, which is if an application A had to be integrated with another application B, the developers from both the groups or architects from both the groups will get together and they'll decide a protocol and they'll decide the interfaces and build an integration. And then if some third team comes in, the two teams from team 3 and team 1 will again get together and decide a separate protocol on how these need to get integrated. So there was a lot of point-to-point between the various different places that was going on. And what really service-oriented architecture did was it defined a methodology. It defined an architecture to provide a uniform way in which these applications and services and data could be integrated with each other. For instance, if you're an application over here that's in the blue, it could be an ERP application A, and that's interfacing with your desktop and cloud applications, and one day you decide that ERP application A needs to be replaced by ERP application B, you could theoretically swap it off and put a new application, and the interfaces to that, because it's a loosely coupled SOA architecture, it won't change. And that's essentially what SOA was. Similarly, you could change the interfaces on the top. You could have new mobile devices and new desktops or portals accessing the same information, accessing the same service-oriented architecture interfaces, and they would work. So that's essentially what SOA was all about. There were some specific technologies like SOAP, WSDL, UDDI, and repository which got associated with SOA as a whole. SOAP had a widespread adoption. A lot of people, a lot of enterprises adopted SOAP. It stands for Simple Object Access Protocol, and it's a protocol which for interfaces. The strange thing is SOAP has the first three initials which are equivalent to SOA, but there's nothing more to it. The second technology that's associated with SOA was WSDL, which provided the interface definition for those services. So it provided a very well-defined documentation, what's the data structure, what are the operations, and there was WS policies and other things like that that was associated with WSDL. Very uniquely, very succinctly defining the interface. Then came the UDDI. That's a place where you can register your service interfaces for other developers to come and discover it and start using it. So UDDI was a standard, and it was ratified, but it lost support because it was extremely, extremely complex. And UDDI was subsequently replaced by repository, which was much more uniformly adopted, much simpler, and it provided a way for people to look at interfaces, start using interfaces, and start discovering those interfaces. But as a whole, some of these technologies that were associated initially with SOA, like SOAP, WSDL, XML was the data structure in which information was exchanged. They were extremely complex and heavyweight. And the repository approach was more like a stick approach, where the enterprise architect had to go and force that all the developers go and consume the SOA interfaces in the way that was defined in the repository. So it was more of a stick approach in the terms of an enterprise architect going around and policing that people use the same interfaces. And then came APIs. And the way APIs came into existence somewhere around 2006, 2007. And the main reason for SOA was more around integration. It was B2B integration. It was application to application integration. The reason in 2000, 2007 APIs came in was a slightly different problem. It was you had your applications sitting here on the right as a company. You have your applications, your cloud applications, your data, and you wanted this application and data to be available to your customers. And your customers could be there on mobile devices, on e-commerce site, or wherever. And it was more of a consumption rather than an integration. You wanted your application and services to be available to your customers. And the way that was made available was using an API, wherein you published an API. Your API could then be plugged in by some developers who would create applications that were native to those mobile devices on the left, or e-commerce experiences that we have on the left. This, in some terms, is kind of similar to SOA, but SOA was more focused on integration, while APIs are more focused on consumption, on increasing consumption. So what are the typical characteristics of an API? If you take a look at the figure over here, you'll see again in the center, inside the circle, that's a company. You can think about that as a company with its all products and services and offerings. And the developers, its own developers, are denoted in red. So these are the people who are developing the applications, they're developing the APIs, and they make it available to their own developers, other set of developers who are building applications, who are building e-commerce sites for the customers to be available, which we see on the top. But there are an additional set of developers that are out there who are available, for whom the traditional SOA interfaces were not available. Now, with the advent of API, what really happened was the company could open up these interfaces to these external developers, a community of developers who are in green, who could then in turn go and develop a lot of other additional apps and services that were based on the core services that you as a company were offering, with the net result that your whole customer base kind of increased significantly. So if you look at the characteristics of an API from a consumption perspective, what really in here is APIs are extremely well documented. Unlike SOA, where you had WSDL and there were machine-to-machine interfaces, but they were not really easy for humans to read, APIs are extremely well documented and well human readable. They're easy to consume. Somebody can come, read the documentation of an API portal and consume it easily. The biggest difference is an API can be self-provisioned by developers and partners. Once you expose an API, put in an API portal, there's a mechanism for external developers to come in, look at the documentation, get self-provisioned access to that API and start using it. And that's a core difference between what an API and SOA traditionally were. And obviously, like I mentioned, it's published through an API portal. So that's essentially what an API is. And it allows businesses to extend their reach. And if you look at the current scenario, what's really happening is instead of the traditional mediums of interaction, which was primarily through web, since the late 90s to early 2000, web obviously exploded. But then after that, if you have seen over the last couple of years, your customers, your partners, the way they interact with your company or even they interact with others is through a lot of different devices, a lot of different phones. So there's mobile phones, obviously, there's tablets, there's gaming consoles, there's all the IoTs, connected devices, connected appliances, and you need a way of reaching to your customers wherever they are. And essentially, APIs from that aspect allows you to extend the reach of your business, take your applications and services, make them available as API, which can then be used by developers who are building specific application on all these different devices or mediums that I show as part of spokes over here. APIs also allow you to capture new opportunities. And a lot of these opportunities are like, I'll quickly go over through some of them, is drive innovation. A good example of that is Twitter. So if you look at Twitter, they obviously did innovation around the 140 character tweets, but they had a lot of challenge around monetization or monetizing their platform. And once they started exposing their tweets, their entire platform as API, what they figured out very quickly was they could monetize these APIs. They made the API access essentially free for developers to test it out or for small numbers of access to their APIs. But for a large set of marketers and analysts who wanted to do segmentation analysis and see trending tweets and things like that, who essentially needed large access to Twitter information, they put a monetization model around it, and that helped them monetize their APIs. Increase reach. With Netflix, you can see, they obviously have a lot of content, video content and movie content, but they had to take that content to thousands of devices. There are thousands of Android phones, iPhone phones, iOS phones, and other cable set-top boxes. And they didn't have the resources to develop an application, network application on each one of those. So they just exposed an API, made them available to developers, and then those developers ended up creating those specific applications, network applications on each of those devices. Support new devices kind of goes to all the different kind of devices that are there, not only iPhones and Android devices, but also IoTs like wearables and sensors that are popping up all over the home, like the Nest sensors and other sensors, and you can now support them through APIs. There are new business models like Twilio. Twilio is right now disrupting the age-old telecommunication industry by essentially making very, very small access to SMSs, to voice calls through very single API with a very fixed low pricing. And that is completely disrupting the traditional telecom model. And then increased partner network, where Salesforce has been effectively using APIs by exposing their functionality to all their applications as APIs. And now more than half of their transactions actually happen not through their Salesforce user interface, but through their APIs, and they can integrate with essentially all the other applications out there. So that is essentially API, and to summarize what's the API advantage, it's really, really easy to consume. They're well documented, self-provisioned. Developers are attracted to use the best APIs. So it's more of a carrot approach rather than a stick approach. So like an SOA, SOAP, WSDL, and UDDI and registry or the repository, it was more of a carrot approach. With API, it's like you publish your API, you market your API, and essentially attract developers to use it. And that's primarily the fundamental difference between API and SOA. Now, given that, let's now talk about some API and SOA myths that exist out there. The first one, obviously, is SOA is a technology, and that we already talked about is not. SOA is a loosely coupled architecture. It's a design philosophy, and it's independent of any vendor, product, technology, or industry trend. It's a very well-defined, loosely coupled architecture that's valid even today. SOA requires web services and SOAP. That's another myth. It does not. SOA, like we mentioned above, it's not limited to any technology. It's not limited to SOAP or web services. Those SOAP were the first implementation of SOA, and it was widely adopted. I mean, the people have been using SOAP for a while, and a lot of enterprises still use SOAP and web services widely. APIs are not SOA, so that's the next myth. Some people say API and SOA are different. At the bottom of it, at the core of it, APIs are still services. They're still service-oriented. They are still taking application functionality and making it available for integration, though the core use case for API is not B2B or application-to-application integration, though it can be, but it's more about consumption and making your application and services available to consumers or to a mass set of people. The other myth that's there that exists right now is APIs are essentially based on REST and JSON. And that's also not true. APIs are much more open. They're more of a business model. They're evolution of SOA, but not limited to REST and JSON. There are new protocols that are coming out. There are protocols like MQTT, which is really, really applicable to IoT, Internet of Things kind of things. There's another one called WebSockets that's really applicable to real-time applications. And all of these could also have APIs, and the API business model could be applicable to this. So don't get restricted to REST and JSON. Think beyond REST and JSON. And the final one is that SOA is primarily internal and APIs are for external, and I think that is also not true. APIs are well meant for consumption, for mass consumption. And we are seeing a lot of use cases where APIs are now being used internally. If you look at the SDN APIs, if you look at the OpenStack APIs, these are all for internal use cases, and they're all adopting APIs. So APIs are getting adopted internally, and in the same way, SOA have been used externally for a lot of B2B integration, for complex integration use cases where you need B2B, a well-defined data structure, and those kind of things. SOA are used externally as well. So what is really the relationship between APIs and SOA? To look at that, what I would like to do is look at when anybody is deploying or designing or thinking about standing up a SOA or API environment, there are three basic categories that they need to think about from a lifecycle perspective. The first one is they need to think about the business foundation, which is essentially the functional tier about their API and SOA. And what I mean by the functional tier is, at the end of the day, you're exposing an application or a service as an API, and need to design that API really, really well, which is what is the data structure of that API, what are the operations that you will be able to do on that API or SOA interface, what would be the life cycle, which is if there are multiple different applications that are being brought in together as a single API or a service, what are the dependencies between them, what's your plan, build, run, and deploy lifecycle, and who are the stakeholders, and how do you kind of collaborate between all of them. So that's like the business foundation. That's the functional tier. The second one is the non-functional tier, which has things like security, mediation, orchestration, quality of service, analytics. So irrespective of whatever the protocol of your API is going to be, these things need to be planned. Any service that you expose will have some level of security. You would need to apply authentication and authorization that goes against, in most enterprise use cases, you will authenticate against an SSO system. In case of consumer-facing applications, you might use some OpenID or social login. Those things have to be there, and they are irrespective of the protocol, whether you use SOAP or use REST or anything else. Similarly, orchestration. You might have multiple calls, or you might have to orchestrate your different services or the API call based on where they're coming from or some business rules. And that's irrespective of the protocol. Again, they're mostly based on the logic, the business logic of what's inside the data packet. Similarly, you need to enforce quality of service and analytics capabilities, and that's the non-functional tier. And then finally, there's a protocol tier based on, and the protocol tier is essentially the consumption tier, wherein you expose your APIs or service for consumptions by developer. And that tier is the one that's tied to the protocol, which is based on SOAP. Then you might want to expose it as a WSDL. If it is REST, then you might want to expose it in an API portal. It might have some OAuth and obviously Swagger artifacts associated with it. If it is MQTT, it might be something else. So there's a slight difference when it comes to publishing protocol. But what I am trying to prove over here, or try to kind of denote over here, is the first two tiers, which is the business tier, the functional tier, and the non-functional tier. They are applicable irrespective of the protocol that you choose to deploy. And every protocol, every service that you deploy, you should be taking care of the life cycle. You should take care about the data architecture. You should decide the data architecture irrespective of the protocol that you end up kind of consuming to make it available on the consumption tier. Similarly, security, mediation, orchestration, all these are irrespective of the protocol. And then you do need something to handle the protocol, but that's a slight veneer on the top. So you don't essentially need multiple different infrastructures to manage REST and SOA. You could use a single unified infrastructure. So let's see how to, what are the differences between API versus SOA and how we can simplify the landscape. The first one is APIs are a superset of web services. It's a business differentiation and not a technical one. By a business differentiation, what I mean is APIs are much, much better suited for external consumption, mass consumption. It's about the carrot approach, like I mentioned. They can be monetized. There's a business model that you can build on top of an API. And that's one thing that's different about API versus SOA. It's really easy to consume. The second one is in terms of documentation, how you document an API. APIs are extremely human readable. You publish them on a portal. Somebody can come and start using them, read the documentation, self-provision, and start using it. But on the same end, it's very difficult to manage change in an API. It's very subjective. They're not very well-defined standards over there. There's WADL, there's Swagger, there's Blueprint, there's RAML, there are a bunch of them over there. But they still not make it machine readable. So every time an API change or some change is made to an API, somebody has to really come, a human has to come, take care of the changes and propagate those changes. Web services were primarily WSDL and WS policy. The benefit of that was that change management was very, very explicit. WSDL and WS policy made it really, really easy for them to be defined. It was a very well-defined machine-readable format when if it's changed, it could be propagated and the machines could regenerate code. But it was very difficult for humans to read it because it was extremely complex. And then from a security perspective, APIs typically leverage OAuth and HTTP, whereas SOA or SOAP leverages web services leverage WS security, SAML, WS trust, and they support message-based security. So given these, what I feel is there's pros and cons to both approaches between APIs and SOA. APIs, obviously, very open, very easy to consume, human readable, but at the same time, change management is limited. Lifecycle is limited. In terms of security, it's just based at the transport level. You cannot go and secure it at the message level, whereas SOAP does allow those. So I think over the next couple of months and years, what we will see in the industry is API and SOA will start converging, and we essentially need both. We need simplified documentation. We need simplified documentation from a consumption perspective, from a documentation gen perspective where a human can come in and start reading it, which API support. And we also need code generation, which SOA or SOAP supported, but APIs don't. And we are seeing some efforts being made in the industry from converging both of those together. From a dependency perspective, APIs, a lot of enterprises are actually taking their existing SOAP services and they're converting them to REST and JSON for simplified documentation and sometimes for mobile consumption, making it available externally. APIs do need SOAP, and there is, when you're converting SOAP into APIs, there's a mediation that you require between the WS standards that SOAP supported and the HTTP and OAuth standards that API. So there's a mediation between APIs and SOAP that's required based on what people are doing, and that essentially requires customers who are deploying or kind of converting the existing SOA into APIs to look at one single infrastructure which can understand both the security standards and do the mediation rather than applying different tiered infrastructure, one to manage SOAP and another to manage APIs. And obviously, this is a list of all the different kinds of standards and policies that platform needs to understand, which is OAuth, header-based signature, SAML, WS security, XACML, OpenID Connect, and we'll obviously see a few more evolved or new standards coming in the industry. So that brings me to the end of this presentation, which is essentially our APIs and SOA converging. And I think the answer to this is really yes. I think that they're both one and the same thing, APIs and SOA. APIs are service-oriented architecture. From that perspective, they have slight different characteristics, which is SOA in its focus on machine-to-machine integration, and primarily from application to application integration, focused more on standardization and lifecycle and forgot about the human aspects in the equation. So it was extremely difficult, though very, very standardized. APIs came in 2000, 2007 from primarily a consumption perspective, how to increase and make consumption of these interfaces easy. But they forgot about management, lifecycle, and control. And what is needed is essentially both. You need easy consumption, but at the same time, you need management, lifecycle, control. And that is what I think is going to happen in the industry, and that's already happening. That brings me to the end. You can go to some of the resources over here to get more information, which is you can go to http://resource.soa.com. You can look at some recordings or follow us on these various different social channels. But thank you. Thank you for listening.
Sachin, thank you for a very good session that really takes into context some of the questions I think many of our attendees and SOA professionals in general are asking. The idea of JSON or REST API versus the vernacular API economy conversation, I think does create a lot of confusion. And while a lot of our audience is very interested in getting into this API opportunity, they're not always clear. So thank you very much for dispelling some myths.
Thank you, Vance.
As you might expect, you've triggered some questions from our attendees, both on the technology side as well as on the business side. So with your permission, let's just turn to questions.
Sure.
Talking about the matriculation, let's say, Sachin, of the SOA professional into an API mindset, a clearly interesting question comes in here. And let me just throw it out there for you. What are the core skills and patterns that an experienced SOA professional should focus on to participate in APIs?
That's a very good question, Vance, around, and we see that a lot, which is a lot of traditional SOA professionals, they're taking their existing interfaces, which were SOAP-based interfaces, and they're opening it up as REST-based APIs. And there are 2 or 3 aspects that these professionals really need to understand in terms of what it takes to convert those into APIs. The first one and the foremost is it's very important to document your APIs. APIs are all about being open. Traditionally, in SOAP, in SOA, they haven't taken a lot of pain in order to document their interfaces. There was a WSDL, but there was a lot of hand-holding. In terms of API, there's an extra effort, and usually we see organizations have specific people who are appointed in order to do API documentation, because it takes a lot of effort in order to go and document your API to provide a lot of examples. So that's the first one. I mean, so you need to go and inculcate in your culture to provide much, much better documentation. The second one is around API evangelism. The whole purpose for APIs is from a business perspective. I mean, there's a business model also behind an API, wherein you want to increase the adoption of API. You want more and more people to use your API. You're not, in most cases, not trying to restrict. Even in B2B APIs where they're not traditionally open API, you want more and more partners to come and enroll for your API. And that requires developer evangelism, which is you go out there, you create, you do hackathons, you explain your partners as to how they can use it and consume your API in various different devices. It's not only documentation, providing them examples of how they can create an Android app, how they can consume and use it in a Google Glass, how they can go and create an iOS app. So giving those examples. And the third difference between API, what SOA architects have to do when they're consuming or transforming into APIs, the interfaces into APIs, is around understanding OAuth, which is a very, very popular security, authentication, and authorization standard that's there for APIs. And they need to go and understand OAuth, and it's not simple. OAuth 1.0 was hard. OAuth 2.0 has addressed some of the shortcomings between OAuth 1 and O, but it's still a little complex. So they need to understand that. But those are things that are patterns and things that SOA architects need to consider.
Sachin, that was a great answer. Thanks very much. You know, you bring up another point here about how people can get started, and here's another great question, I think, on that topic. And it simply reads, we're looking for a simple POC project for APIs. Does SOA software have a best practice or a template that would let us design and launch an API project?
Yes, we do. We do. So what we have on our site, there's a free trial which you can request, wherein you can get access to our software. And that provides you with a lot of examples, and it gives you actually an access to our API management platform, wherein you can look at examples of how other people or very quickly take a SOAP interface and convert it into API and the best practices around that. The second thing is, along with that, we have some best practices ebook, which kind of goes from soup to nuts of what you need to do around creating an API, designing an API, securing an API, managing the QoS, and managing the entire lifecycle of an API, which is from the design stage to planning to deployment to staging, and then retiring. There's a lot of wealth of information over there that you can go and access.
It's excellent, because we do have a couple of questions that came in about your product portfolio. And let me just kind of summarize them here. And here I think is a good one. The questioner says, I see a lot of product downloads in the breakout room. Can the SOA software speaker list the product offerings that they have for API and API management? And does it reflect the API lifecycle he spoke of?
Absolutely. That's a good question. And what we have from a SOA perspective, we have a solution that's called the API management solution that is inclusive of both API and SOA. We are offering a converged infrastructure. We believe you just need one infrastructure to manage both your API and SOA because the differences are very, very minor between the two. There are three products as part of this solution that are extremely well integrated with each other. The first one is to manage the life cycle of your API, which is when you conceptualize your API, you plan your API, then you need to design, then you need to build it, you need to operate it, and then retire it. The entire life cycle around that, we have a product called API Lifecycle Manager or Lifecycle Manager for API. That's the first product that can be used for both API lifecycle as well as it's the leader in terms of SOA lifecycle. The second product that we have is what's known as API Gateway. And again, it can be used as both as a SOA gateway and an API gateway. And what it does, what it provides is all the operational aspects of your API, which is securing your API, managing authentication and authorization, doing WS security, threat protection, securing your APIs against threats or denial of service attacks, mediation, protocol mediation and security mediation, so SOAP to REST, REST to SOAP, and all other kinds of platform integrations. It does orchestration as well, and it does monitoring and analytics. That's the second product, which is our API gateway. And finally, we have a product called Community Manager, which is the developer, which is the API portal. Wherein you publish your API, you document your API, you allow developers to come in, read your documentation, and self-provision an API. And it creates a community where developers can essentially interact with each other, learn from each other, and essentially give feedback to the API producer around the effectiveness of API. So essentially three products that are extremely well integrated, and they're available both in the cloud, on-premise, or as a hybrid solution wherein you can take and deploy some components on the cloud and some on-premise.
Oh, excellent. So your offering is not purely inside the DMZ if it doesn't have to be. I could use some of this as an actual service offering.
Exactly, exactly.
So a very terrific session. Sachin Agarwal, Vice President of Product Marketing and Strategy at SOA Software. Thanks very much for a conversation about not only the blurring lines between API and SOA, but ways to get out of the wilderness and actually get both of these projects underway in the enterprise. Really great session.
Thanks, Vance. Thanks for having me here.
And as we love to do here at SOA Summit, we're going to put a slide up here with several other links that Sachin mentioned. There was a lot of material that we talked about at the high level as well as the products that he talked about. Some of those downloads will be available in your breakout room, but here's a slide with many more resources. Thanks again, everyone.